Andrew had always been the rock of his family, a respected businessman owning a small financial consulting firm he had built from nothing with sheer grit and years of effort. His life was a carefully constructed routine of responsibilities and commitments, but he thrived on it. He relished being the go-to guy, the problem solver, both at work and at home. Anne, his wife, and Sophie, his teenage daughter, were his world, and he made it his mission to provide them with a life of comfort and security. His relationship with Anne, stretching back over 2 decades, had begun in a blaze of passion and shared dreams. They had built a life together, brick by brick, both literally and figuratively, and Andrew believed that foundation was unshakable, anchored in mutual respect and deep affection. Though the initial spark had dimmed over the years, their marriage still felt solid, a comfortable rhythm of shared routines and the quiet certainty that they would always be there for each other. Sophie, his 17-year-old daughter, presented a different kind of connection, more complex, more challenging. Adolescence had erected a wall between them, a chasm Andrew hadn't known how to bridge. She existed in her own world, headphones clamped over her ears, phone glued to her hand, always at full volume, barely acknowledging him. There were times when Andrew attempted to reach out, offering help with her schoolwork or inviting her out for lunch, but she consistently rebuffed him with a cool, dismissive excuse. Despite this outward coldness, he never stopped worrying about her, clinging to the hope that this difficult phase would eventually pass that afternoon. However, everything would shatter. Andrew sat stiffly in a molded plastic chair in the sterile white doctor's office. The clock on the wall seemed to tick with agonizing slowness. He had been battling persistent stomach pain and unexplained weight loss for months, but he never in his wildest nightmares imagined anything like this could be happening to him. Not to someone who had always been so strong, so in control. The doctor entered carrying a manila folder filled with test results. A shadow hung in his eyes, a somber weight Andrew recognized instantly. Years of navigating the complexities of human interaction had honed his intuition. He knew what was coming before the words even left the doctor's mouth. Mr. Andrew, I am very sorry the tests are conclusive. You have cancer and it is terminal. The words landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He stopped hearing the rest of the explanation. The room around him seemed to dissolve, blur at the edges, and a tidal wave of emotion crashed over him. Raw fear, stark panic, suffocating sadness. The bedrock of his life, so meticulously ordered, so predictable, had just cracked open, revealing a gaping abyss, a definite, unchangeable end, when the doctor began to outline palliative care options. Andrew simply nodded, his mind reeling, unable to process the meaning. That night, driving home, the weight of the diagnosis felt almost unbearable. He pulled into the driveway and stepped into the house, and everything appeared utterly normal. Anne was curled up on the sofa, flipping through a home decor magazine. Sophie was barricaded in her room as always. The stark contrast between the mundane normalcy of the scene and the raging storm inside him was excruciating. He sat down beside Anne and took her hand, the familiar softness of her skin, a sensation that had always been a source of comfort, now felt distant, almost foreign. He felt the floorboards shifting beneath his feet. Anne. He began, his voice thick with emotion. We need to talk. His wife turned to him, her eyes still scanning the glossy pages of the magazine. About what I got. The test results, he said, the words catching in his throat. It is not good, Anne. I have cancer and they said there is no cure. She remained perfectly still for a beat, as if his words were foreign language needing translation. When their meaning finally registered, her face drained of color, her eyes welled with tears. But what followed was not a comforting embrace, not a wave of shared grief. Instead, a tremor of panic seized her. Cancer, Andrew, she whispered, her voice tight with fear. What does that mean? How long? He shook his head, a helpless gesture. Not long, he said. Maybe months. Anne recoiled slightly on the couch, as if needing physical space to absorb the enormity of it. A suffocating silence descended between them, heavy and suffocating. She could not meet his eyes. In that moment, Sophie walked into the room, sensing the charged atmosphere. Dad, is everything all right? Sophie asked, her voice small, laced with disbelief. Andrew, his voice trembling, told her as well. Honey, it is serious, very serious. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house curdled and soured with alarming speed. What Andrew had desperately hoped would be a period of shared grief and family unity devolved into eye distance and palpable coldness. Anne began spending more and more time away from the house, avoiding any real conversation. Sophie retreated even further into her headphones and her digital world. When Andrew tried to talk about his deepest fears about how he wanted to spend his final months with the family, he was met with slammed doors, evasive replies, and flimsy excuses. One day, after returning from a particularly brutal treatment session, Andrew walked into an empty house. On the kitchen table, a stark white envelope with his name scrawled across it in Anne's handwriting sat alone. He opened it, his heart pounding, a sickening premonition washing over him. "Andrew, I cannot do this. I cannot watch you waste away. I am taking Sophie with me. I do not know when or if I will be back." He read and reread the words, praying they would somehow rearrange themselves into something less devastating. But they remained fixed, etched into his mind like a brand of despair. The silence in the house, which had once been a sanctuary of peace, now became a deafening testament to his utter isolation. Abandoned by his wife and daughter, Andrew now faced not only the relentless march of cancer, but the crushing weight of being deserted by the very people he loved most. The days after Anne and Sophie left stretched into a bleak and agonizing landscape. Each morning was a brutal awakening to the stark reality he now inhabited. The house, once a vibrant and welcoming home, now felt alien and hollow. The silence was so profound it was almost a physical presence pressing in on him. Andrew had never experienced such bone-deep loneliness. He remembered a time when this house echoed with life, with laughter and lively conversation, especially on weekends. Sophie's bright voice echoing down the hallway, begging him to play with her, or Anne's warm laughter bubbling up from the kitchen when something funny happened at breakfast. Now those echoes of the past seemed like fragments of another life, a distant dream from which he had been violently jolted awake. The physical pain from the cancer was a constant torment, but it paled in comparison to the soul-crushing weight of loneliness. Sometimes Andrew wondered if the true cruelty of the disease was not the pain itself, but the fact that he had to endure it utterly alone. He missed Anne's touch, her mere presence beside him, even though their relationship had become strained and distant in recent years. And Sophie, he wrestled with the agonizing realization that he had failed to nurture a real connection with his daughter. She had grown into a young woman so quickly, and the gulf between them, which he had naively believed was temporary, now seemed insurmountable. In the first few days after they left, Andrew deluded himself into thinking Anne would call. Sophie would send a text message. He desperately clung to the hope that they would at least care about what he was going through, that his absence would leave a gaping void in their lives, just as their abandonment had ripped a hole in his. But the truth was brutal and unwavering. There were no phone calls, no messages. Their silence was deafening. Loneliness became his constant, cruel companion. When Andrew wasn't at the hospital for treatment sessions, which he knew in his heart were only prolonging the inevitable, he spent hours in the living room staring at family photos. The picture frames seemed to mock him, showcasing moments of joy that now felt like elaborate fabrications. The happiness he had so diligently constructed had shattered into fragments, and the future he had envisioned with his wife and daughter had evaporated like a mirage in the desert heat. On the loneliest nights, Andrew replayed memories of times he had tried to connect with Sophie. He remembered when she was a little girl, she would run to him, launching herself into his arms at the slightest hint of his presence. The teenager he now knew was a stranger, always plugged into headphones, lost in a digital world he could not access and did not understand. And then he began to question, when did she drift so far away? When did he cease to be important to her? Anne, on the other hand, remained an even more painful enigma. Their marriage had become worn down by the slow erosion of time, but Andrew had always clung to the belief that even with the fading of passion, a deep, enduring love remained. Now, he was not so sure Anne had walked away from him at the moment he needed her most. She had simply fled, taking Sophie with her, as if the prospect of life with a sick man was too unbearable a burden. The words Anne had written in the letter, "I cannot watch you waste away," echoed in his mind with a chilling coldness he never thought he would hear from his wife. For weeks, the searing pain of betrayal gnawed at Andrew from the inside out. Each day, he found himself staring at his phone, half expecting it to ring, hoping against hope that Anne or even Sophie would reach out. But he always hesitated. Pride mixed with a deep sense of hurt held him back. He knew that if they truly wanted to, they could have come back. They had made a choice. And that choice had been to leave him behind. Over time, something within Andrew began to shift. The agonizing pain of rejection slowly gave way to a new kind of clarity. A cold resolve hardened in his chest. Andrew realized that while he could not control the time he had left, he still possessed the power to control what he left behind. And so he began to contemplate what would happen after he was gone. Anne and Sophie had abandoned him in his darkest hour, but he knew with a chilling certainty that they would eventually return. They would come back not out of love, not out of remorse, but for the money. It was this stark realization that now fueled him the life he had painstakingly built. The wealth he had fought so fiercely to accumulate would be the magnet drawing them back into his orbit, not for him, but for themselves. That is when Andrew conceived a plan. If they were going to return, it would not be a simple matter of inheriting his estate. He had the opportunity to make them confront the devastating consequences of their actions. They would have to prove that something beyond mere greed still existed within them. He would rewrite his will, yes, but not as a crude act of punishment. He wanted something more intricate, more profound. He wanted to force them to face the undeniable truth of their abandonment, and perhaps in the process show them that family was worth more than any inheritance. So amidst the gnawing pain and the crushing loneliness, Andrew began to meticulously craft his plan. A plan that would demand more from them than just a polite appearance at his funeral. If they wanted any part of his inheritance, they would have to earn it. Time relentlessly marched forward, and Andrew's illness progressed with cruel efficiency. The days blurred together in a haze of physical pain and emotional resignation. The loneliness, which had initially felt like an open, gaping wound, had now become a familiar, almost comfortable burden. He had come to terms with the stark reality that he would likely die without ever seeing his wife or daughter again. The endless hospital visits continued, each one chipping away at his dwindling reserves of hope. The faint glimmer of a miracle had long since been extinguished from his mind. It was during one of those draining afternoons after returning from a particularly grueling appointment that Andrew heard the distinct sound of a car pulling into his driveway. At first, he paid it little attention. Neighbors were always coming and going. But then he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching his front door. He froze, a knot of apprehension and a flicker of something akin to expectation tightening in his stomach. When the doorbell rang, his heart leaped into his throat. He rose slowly, each movement sending sharp jolts of pain through his body, and walked to the door. When he opened it, he stood frozen, his stomach plummeting at the sight of Anne and Sophie standing on his doorstep. Anne looked different, her face etched with a weariness as if time had also been unkind to her. Sophie, standing beside her mother, was taller, more womanly, but there was something in her eyes Andrew could not immediately decipher. At first, they both just stood there motionless, as if hesitant to take the first step across the threshold. An awkward, oppressive silence hung in the air. "Can we come in?" Anne asked, her voice low, almost pleading. Andrew nodded mutely, without uttering a word, and stepped back to allow them entry. His heart was racing, a chaotic mix of emotions churning within him. They had returned, but why? He knew his condition had deteriorated significantly, and somehow they must have found out. Were they there because of him or because of something else lurking in the back of their minds? Andrew already knew the answer, but he consciously chose not to dwell on it. He closed the door and turned to find them standing awkwardly in the living room. The room remained exactly as they had left it months ago, untouched, frozen in time. Anne's eyes darted around the room as if she were a stranger in a place that had once been her home. Sophie remained silent, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I heard things got worse," Anne finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We thought we should be here, but you." Andrew tasted a bitter irony on his tongue. He desperately wanted to believe their motivation was sincere, that they had finally grasped the enormity of their mistake in abandoning him. But the deep wound of betrayal was too raw, too fresh to allow any real hope to take root. The only certainty he held onto was the unspoken knowledge that they were aware of the inheritance, and that was the true driving force behind their sudden reappearance. However, he chose to mask his cynicism. He knew he had to tread carefully, not to frighten away whatever game was about to unfold. If his plan was to succeed, he needed to exercise patience. He gestured for them to sit down. Sophie, still silent, was the first to sink onto the sofa, while Anne hesitated for a moment before following suit. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, suffocating with unspoken emotions. Andrew felt a surge of anger rising within him, a burning desire to confront them, right then and there. But he held back. It was not the right moment yet. They needed to believe he was vulnerable, that they could regain control of the situation. "How are you?" Andrew asked, trying to maintain a steady but calm tone. Anne clasped her hands tightly in her lap, avoiding his gaze. "We are fine," she said. But the words sounded hollow, devoid of any genuine feeling. Sophie remained mute, her eyes fixed on some distant point in the room. Andrew knew that the fragile connection between them, already fractured, felt like a thread stretched to its breaking point. "You look exhausted," Anne remarked, her eyes finally meeting his. noticing Andrew's pale and gaunt face. "Cancer tends to do that to you," he responded, his voice flat, each word a painful reminder of his failing body. Another silence descended upon the room, longer this time. Andrew understood this was only the opening move in a complex game of strategy. They were physically present, but he needed to discern their true intentions. Like a chess match, he would carefully calculate each move, meticulously preparing the ground for what was to come. The plan was in motion, and he was determined to see it through to the end. Finally, Andrew pushed himself to his feet, even though his body felt weak, and faced them both directly. "If you are staying, you better settle in," he said, his voice firm but laced with weariness. "It has been a long time since this house felt any warmth, and I doubt anything has changed in that regard." Anne looked at him, a mixture of discomfort and resignation flickering in her eyes. Sophie finally lifted her gaze, but remained silent. Their return had begun, but Andrew knew the real confrontation. The true reckoning was still to come. He was simply waiting for the right moment to strike. The days that followed Anne and Sophie's return were unsettlingly quiet. They were physically present in the house, but their presence felt strangely hollow, as if a heavy, unspoken tension hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Andrew watched them both in silence, carefully analyzing every gesture, every fleeting exchange of glances. It was a delicate dance of unspoken motives where no one dared to make the first truly revealing move. He sensed that despite their physical proximity, they remained emotionally distant. The nights were particularly long and isolating. Anne slept in the guest room, and Sophie retreated to her old bedroom, barricading herself behind her phone as usual. Andrew, for his part, spent sleepless nights sitting in his worn armchair in the living room, wrestling with the reality that this had become his life. The plan he had been meticulously crafting for weeks now felt more daunting to execute with them under the same roof, but he knew it was absolutely necessary. One sun-drenched afternoon, Andrew finally decided to initiate the first phase of his plan. He sat at the dining room table, the golden sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, and called for Anne and Sophie to join him. They entered hesitantly, as if summoned to a battlefield, and sat down in strained silence. "I have been thinking," Andrew began, his voice hoarse and weary, "that maybe it would be good for us to spend some time together. I do not know how much time I have left, and I would like to do something we have not done in a long time. Be a family." Sophie, still staring at the tabletop, flinched while Anne attempted a weak, forced smile. "Of course, Andrew, we can do whatever you want," she replied. But Andrew could detect the underlying discomfort in her carefully chosen words. "I thought we could look back a little," Andrew continued, his voice softening. "There are so many things we have not talked about in a long time, good memories that feel like we have left behind. Maybe it is time to revisit those moments." Sophie finally lifted her gaze, her face hardened. "Dad, why now?" she asked, her voice sharp-edged. "Looking back at the past is not going to change what is happening." The raw coldness in her voice cut through Andrew like a shard of ice. Her directness was almost brutal, perhaps the only one of them willing to speak with any semblance of honesty. But the harshness of her words stung more than he had anticipated. "I know that," Andrew replied, struggling to maintain his composure. "But sometimes revisiting the past can help us understand things. Better understand why things happened the way they did." He looked directly at Anne, who quickly averted her gaze, unable to meet the weight of his unspoken accusation. A long silence stretched between them before Anne finally spoke. "If that is what you want, we can do that." Andrew nodded, masking his disappointment. He knew it was not genuine. This was all part of the elaborate charade they were engaged in. He could not force them to feel anything real, but he wanted to test their resolve, their patience, and perhaps discover if any flicker of genuine emotion still remained within them. Over the next few days, Andrew guided them through a series of carefully orchestrated family rituals. He unearthed old photo albums reminiscing about cherished moments from Sophie's childhood, sun-drenched beach vacations, joyous birthday parties, the simple everyday moments that now felt impossibly distant. He told Sophie how incredibly proud he was of the young woman she had become, even though it seemed to matter little to her anymore. However, beneath the veneer of these nostalgic moments, Andrew could clearly see their underlying disinterest. Sophie barely glanced at the photos, and Anne, though she feigned engagement, was always mentally somewhere else, her thoughts clearly miles away. He watched them both intently, searching for any flicker of genuine regret, any sign that they were present for something more than the looming inheritance. But there was nothing, just uncomfortable silences and superficial interactions. One evening, Andrew surprised them with dinner. He mustered the strength to cook, despite his weakening body, preparing a dish they used to enjoy, an old family recipe passed down from his mother. The kitchen filled with the comforting, familiar aroma, and for a fleeting moment it seemed as if things could somehow revert to the way they once were. But when they sat down at the table, the palpable emotional distance was undeniable. Andrew began attempting to break the oppressive silence. This was my father's favorite dish. He always said family was the most important thing anyone could ever have. I used to believe that too. Anne poked at the food on her plate, pushing it around with her fork without lifting her eyes. And do you still believe that, she asked, her tone laced with a skepticism that sounded more like a challenge than genuine curiosity? Andrew managed a weak, bitter smile. I think I am learning a few things now that I did not know before. The rest of the dinner passed in strained silence, and that night Andrew felt more exhausted than ever, not just physically but emotionally drained. It was devastating to confront the reality that despite his desperate attempts, their coldness remained unyielding. They were present, yes, but as detached observers and not active participants, and the realization broke something inside him, yet he persisted. He needed to see just how far they would go. Their patience was being tested, and time was now his only weapon. In every moment they spent together, Andrew watched, analyzed every subtle reaction. If he was going to die, he would die knowing the unvarnished truth. A few days later, Andrew decided it was time to confront them more directly. They were all gathered in the living room when he began to speak, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I know why you came back. His words hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water. Anne stared at him, her eyes wide with shock, and Sophie immediately averted her gaze. The suffocating silence that followed was so profound, it felt as if the very air had been sucked from the room. You came back because of the inheritance, he continued, his voice gaining strength. It was not out of love or missing me or regret. It was for the money. Anne opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Andrew did not wait for her denial. He knew they were already ensnared in their own web of guilt, and this was merely the first step in his carefully laid plan. I have not finalized the will yet, he continued, his gaze unwavering, and there is something I need from you before I decide what to do. You will have to prove to me that you still care, really care. The silence that followed Andrew's words stretched on endlessly. Anne and Sophie sat frozen, as if each was struggling to fully grasp the weight of what he had just said. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, charged with unspoken emotions. Andrew watched them both, feeling the immense weight of the moment pressing down on his already weakened shoulders. He knew this was the pivotal moment, the point of no return that would irrevocably alter everything. Anne was the first to react. She shook her head slowly, her expression a complicated mix of shock and a feeble attempt to deny what she had just heard. Andrew, how can you even think that of us? Her voice, a strained blend of indignation and fragility. We came because you are sick. We came because we are your family. It is not just about money. Andrew watched Anne's face intently, searching for any flicker of genuine sincerity. Was she being truthful, or were these words merely a desperate attempt to salvage their carefully constructed facade? He desperately wanted to believe that their relationship had not completely disintegrated to this point, but the raw wound of their abandonment was still too deep, too painful. Family, Andrew laughed. The sound that escaped his lips was bitter and harsh. When I needed you most, you left. You abandoned me and Sophie. You shut yourself off in your own world and vanished. You both disappeared for months, and now when my death is imminent, you suddenly reappear. Do you honestly think I am blind to your motives? He turned his gaze to Sophie, who remained silent, her head still bowed. She could not meet his eyes, and that simple act of avoidance hurt more than Anne's carefully crafted evasions. Andrew desperately wanted her to speak, to say anything. He yearned to see if his daughter was still buried somewhere beneath the thick wall of indifference she had erected. Sophie finally broke the silence, her words not at all what Andrew had expected. I did not know what to do, Dad. I did not know how to deal with all of this. I wanted to run away. Her voice was barely audible, almost a whisper, but it carried a surprising weight of sincerity. Andrew looked at her more closely. For the first time since their return, he saw a crack in the cold mask Sophie had been wearing. The pain she carried now seemed genuine. He remembered what it was like to be young, how overwhelming emotions could be too confusing, too intense to process effectively. Even so, the sting of her desertion was still sharp. Run away, Andrew repeated, his voice thick with emotion. I was dying, Sophie, I still am, and all you could do was run away. Sophie bit her lip, her gaze still fixed on the floor. Anne reached out and placed a comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder, a gesture of support but also of silence, as if wanting to shield her from further confrontation. I understand this is hard for you, Sophie, Andrew continued, his voice softening slightly. But you need to understand that I did not have a choice. I could not run. I stayed here alone. Anne, still seated beside Sophie, seemed increasingly agitated, as if desperately searching for the right words to say. There were simply no words that could adequately repair the damage that had been done. Finally, she straightened up in her chair, taking a deep breath. "You are right, Andrew," she said, her voice weary and defeated. "I abandoned you. I abandoned our life together. And there is no excuse for it." She paused, the words heavy on her tongue. "I was scared. I was selfish. I could not bear the thought of losing you, seeing you suffer every day. But I know that does not justify what I did." Anne's words hung in the air, and Andrew felt a painful tightness in his chest. He desperately wanted to believe that this sudden outpouring of regret was genuine, and perhaps it was. But he could not completely shake the nagging suspicion that the inheritance still loomed large in their motivations. "That does not change what I said." Andrew responded, his voice calmer but still firm. "I am going to die, and you came back when you realized I still had something to leave behind. I do not want an empty apology. I want to see if you truly care deeply." Anne and Sophie remained silent, their expressions a complex mixture of regret, fear, and a subtle undercurrent of guilt. Andrew knew he was pushing them to their breaking point, perhaps even testing himself, searching for some lingering thread of connection, some reason to offer forgiveness, or simply to confirm his deepest mistrust. "I have not changed my will yet," Andrew finally said, his voice low and steady. "You can still inherit everything, but you will have to prove to me that you are still my family. I am not talking about a simple act of kindness or empty words of regret. I want to see real commitment. I want to see what you would do if you knew there would be no money in the end." He looked directly into Anne's eyes, then into Sophie's. "You will have to stay here with me until the end. Take care of me. Walk with me through every step of this journey. I do not want a comfortable goodbye. I want you to feel the full weight of what you put me through." Silence once again enveloped the room. Anne took a deep, shuddering breath, visibly shaken, and Sophie tensed even further. They both understood the choice was now entirely theirs. Stay and face the consequences, or leave again. "I know this is hard," Andrew continued, his voice softening even further. "But if you truly still care, you will prove it." He pushed himself to his feet slowly, feeling the immense weight of the conversation pressing down on his frail body. "You have time to think," he said. "The decision is yours." The weight of that decision hung in the air like a palpable shadow. After the raw confrontation in the living room, Anne and Sophie retreated to their respective rooms, each lost in their own swirling thoughts and conflicting emotions. Andrew remained in his armchair, watching the encroaching darkness outside the window, feeling the profound weight of the words he had just spoken. He knew he had challenged them in a harsh, perhaps even cruel manner, but he also believed it was a necessary act of truth-seeking. It was time to see just how far they were willing to go. The following days unfolded in an oppressive silence. Anne and Sophie moved through the house, tentatively, as if unsure of how to act or react to the changed dynamic. Andrew observed their discomfort, but he felt a strange sense of peace with his decision. They needed to confront the full weight of their past choices. He could not soften the blow or make it easier for them. Anne, for her part, made tentative attempts to reach out subtly, though still maintaining a noticeable distance. She prepared dinner on a few evenings and offered perfunctory help, like fetching his medication or driving Andrew to his hospital appointments. But these gestures felt mechanical and devoid of genuine emotion. Andrew sensed it. She was physically present, but her mind still seemed miles away, torn between a sense of obligation and a genuine desire to reconnect with the man who had once been the center of her life. Sophie, on the other hand, remained largely cloaked in her usual silence, barely interacting with her father. However, Andrew began to notice subtle shifts in his daughter's behavior. She no longer vanished into her room for hours on end, isolating herself with her phone. Occasionally, he would catch her standing in the doorway of the living room, watching him from a distance, as if trying to understand the man who now seemed so drastically changed from the father she once knew. The vast gulf between them still existed, but something subtle had shifted. There was a quiet unease, a palpable discomfort that suggested she was in some way processing everything that had transpired. One morning, while Andrew was sitting in the kitchen sipping his coffee, Sophie walked in. It was unusual to see her at this early hour. She typically avoided any interaction before noon. This time, however, she seemed determined to speak. She sat down at the table without uttering a word, her eyes fixed on the coffee cup in front of him. For a long, agonizing moment, the silence hung heavy in the air until Sophie finally broke it. "Dad," she began hesitantly, her voice barely a whisper. I know you think I only came back because of the inheritance, and maybe that was partly true at first. I will not lie. I was confused, angry, but now that I am here, this is killing me. Andrew looked up at his daughter, genuinely surprised by the sudden outpouring of honesty. Sophie still kept her head bowed, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her shirt. I did not know how to handle this, Dad. I did not know what to say or how to help you. Running away seemed easier than facing what was happening, but I realize now that it only made everything worse. This raw confession cracked something open inside Andrew. He had waited so long to hear words like these, but when they finally came, they did not bring simple, easy relief. Part of him instinctively wanted to protect himself, to not be drawn in again to guard his wounded heart, but another deeper part of him yearned to reach out to embrace her and tell her everything would somehow be all right. He struggled to find a precarious balance between these conflicting emotions. I did not know how to handle it either, Sophie. Andrew replied, his voice weary but infused with a newfound sincerity. I was here alone, and it made me see a lot of things, not just about you, but about myself as well. Sophie nodded, her face still etched with guilt. I cannot undo what happened, Dad. But if you still want me to stay, I will. I will stay. Not because of the money, but because I do not want to lose you without really trying. Those simple words hit Andrew with a force he had not anticipated. He looked at his daughter, truly seeing her for the first time in months. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes that he had not witnessed in years. Faint echo of the little girl who used to run to him, arms outstretched, full of life and unreserved love. There was genuine sincerity in her voice, and for the first time since their abandonment, he began to believe that maybe she still cared. Then stay, he said, his voice quiet but firm. But do it for yourself, not for me. Sophie nodded again, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Andrew saw tears well up in her eyes. She quickly wiped them away, attempting to hide her vulnerability, but for Andrew, that small gesture spoke volumes, and on the other hand, remained stubbornly distant. Although her actions indicated a willingness to remain physically present, there was still a deep chasm separating them. Andrew knew that the process of reconciliation with Anne would be far more complex, more deeply entrenched in years of unresolved issues. He also knew time was rapidly running out. Not just his own finite time, but the rapidly dwindling window of opportunity to resolve what remained fractured between them. As his illness relentlessly progressed, and Andrew felt his body weakening with each passing day, he began to accept the inevitable end was near. But at least he had finally discovered one undeniable truth. Sophie was willing to try. Now, it remained to be seen if Anne would follow suit. The days dragged on with agonizing slowness as Andrew's health visibly deteriorated. The bone-deep exhaustion now felt like a permanent state, and even the simplest act of rising from bed required a strength. He could barely muster each day that dawned. The inevitable end drew palpably nearer, and Andrew could feel it in his bones, in the shallow, rasping breaths he struggled to take, in the way his strength seemed to drain from him with each passing hour. The days moved with a cruel, deliberate slowness, as if time itself was stretching out, prolonging his suffering. The exhaustion was no longer merely physical. It was a profound weariness that emanated from deep within his soul, relentlessly draining his will to continue day after day. Each morning, simply getting out of bed was a silent, agonizing battle, one that his body increasingly lost. Every movement sent sharp jolts of pain through his ravaged body, and he felt the oppressive weight of the end pressing down on him with every labored breath. Each inhalation now a conscious effort, as if life itself was slowly slipping away with each exhale. Andrew knew with unwavering certainty that the end was imminent, and the imminence of death cast a heavy pall over each passing second, making them feel heavier than lead. The house itself seemed to mirror his deteriorating condition. The rooms that had once pulsed with vibrant life and lively conversation were now steeped in a heavy, oppressive silence. Sophie, however, was a constant presence, always there, though still enveloped in a quietude that spoke volumes more than words ever could. There was something different about her quiet presence, a steadfast consistency that Andrew had not anticipated. Accompanied him to his seemingly endless medical appointments without a word of complaint, even though the interminable waits and sterile atmosphere clearly bothered her deeply at home. She offered to help with small mundane tasks like bringing him a glass of water or gently adjusting the blankets over his frail body. It was not just the mere act of assistance, but the quiet, genuine care behind it, the unexpected patience she displayed that slowly began to erode the thick emotional barriers that had stood between them. For the first time in years, at night when the pain became excruciating and sleep remained elusive, Sophie would sit quietly beside his bed, holding his hand with a tenderness that deeply moved him. She did not offer platitudes or empty reassurances, but the simple fact of her unwavering presence. Just her quiet vigil by his side spoke more profoundly than any words ever could. Andrew felt the unexpected warmth of her hand clasped in his, and each gentle touch felt like a silent, tentative attempt to mend the fractured pieces of their relationship broken over the years. She is truly trying, Andrew thought, tears welling up in his eyes, too weak to restrain them. Sophie, the daughter he had mistakenly believed he had lost forever. Somewhere in the tumultuous landscape of her teenage years was actually here. Every small gesture, every shared moment of quiet silence was a tentative step toward what he had always yearned for, a genuine reconnection, a fragile, unspoken forgiveness. Began to blossom between them, something that emerged with each hesitant glance exchanged in every quiet moment, where Sophie's hand remained steadfastly clasped in his. That little girl who had once run to him seeking comfort and protection was now here in his final days attempting to reconnect with the man he had once been. It was as if in the stark proximity of death, they were both rediscovering a new way to love and to understand each other. Anne, however, remained an enigma, shrouded in a veil of emotional distance. While her actions demonstrated a willingness to remain physically present, there was still an invisible wall separating them Andrew could not penetrate. Her actions were almost robotic, preparing meals, fetching medications, tidying the house, but devoid of any discernible warmth or personal investment. There was no lingering trace of the fiery passion that had once ignited their marriage, only a hollow formality, a sense of moral obligation that she seemed to fulfill with a painful emptiness. Andrew watched her from a weary distance, attempting to decipher what was truly transpiring in her mind. He knew she was wrestling with her own ghosts, her own internal demons. But it was increasingly difficult for him to accept that even in the stark shadow of his impending death, Anne remained unable to shatter the barrier she had so deliberately constructed between them. He dimly remembered the early days of their relationship, when they had been inseparable, when her hand would instinctively find his touch now. Everything felt so irrevocably distant, so irretrievably lost in the mists of time. Andrew knew their shared time was rapidly dwindling, but even now he felt utterly unable to reach Anne one late afternoon as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a nostalgic golden glow across the house. Anne finally broke the cycle of oppressive silence. Her footsteps were soft, almost hesitant, as she approached the worn armchair where Andrew, already profoundly exhausted, was. Watching the fading light of day, the gentle light bathed his face, highlighting the deep lines of fatigue and pain that had etched themselves onto his face over the past months. Anne paused hesitantly before sinking down onto the small ottoman beside him, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. Her fingers intertwined as if desperately searching for something to hold on to. The air around them felt thick and heavy, charged with unspoken emotions. She looked at Andrew, her eyes shimmering in the fading afternoon light, but devoid of the confident spark he had once known. "I need to talk to you, Andrew," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the sheer weight of her words was pressing down on her. Andrew did not respond immediately. He slowly turned his head, seeking her gaze. He understood this was a pivotal moment, the moment when the unspoken truths that had festered between them for so long would finally surface. But at the same time, a part of him deep down dreaded what she was about to say. Time was running out, and he was unsure if whatever remained between them would ever be enough. Anne took a deep, shuddering breath before continuing, as if summoning the last vestiges of her courage to confront the unvarnished truth. "I do not know what to say to even begin to justify what I did. In fact, there is no real justification." Her voice trembled slightly, and Andrew noticed her hands were shaking visibly too. "I abandoned you when you needed me most. I was selfish." Andrew felt a deep ache resonate within him upon hearing those words, but they were not a surprise. He had already known the raw truth. What truly stung was the palpable tone of regret and underlying fear in her voice that he could no longer ignore. Anne continued her words, tumbling out with difficulty, as if each one was a heavy burden she desperately needed to unburden herself of. "I got lost in fear, Andrew." She confessed, her voice cracking. "In the crippling fear of losing you, I was not emotionally equipped to watch you suffer. Foolishly thought that by running away, I was somehow protecting myself from the inevitable pain. But I only succeeded in making your pain infinitely worse." She paused, her voice catching, and for the first time, Andrew fully grasped the immense weight of that devastating truth. The enduring love they had once shared was still present beneath the surface, but buried beneath thick, suffocating layers of fear and guilt, and simply had not possessed the emotional fortitude to confront the impending loss. And despite his best efforts, Andrew knew deep down that there were irreparable parts of their shared history that would never be fully reconciled. "I know you believe I came back for the money," Anne continued, her voice now barely audible. "And maybe at first I did return for the wrong reasons. My motives were undeniably clouded, but being here, Andrew, in this house with you, I have finally realized the enormity of what I have lost, what we have both lost." As her tear-filled eyes finally met his, Andrew saw something that had been absent for far too long: raw vulnerability. The deep, abiding love was still there, flickering, faintly lost in the long shadows of fear and past mistakes, but undeniably still present. A single tear escaped and traced a lonely path down her careworn face, and this time she did not attempt to hide it. Andrew closed his eyes for a fleeting moment, feeling the immense weight of everything they had endured together. He knew he could not simply erase the past, the agonizing pain of her. Abandonment was still there, alive and raw, but at the same time a profound shift had occurred within him. Something deep inside him yearned to forgive, yearned to allow their shared story to conclude in a more dignified, more compassionate way. Time was relentlessly slipping away, and he instinctively knew the words that needed to be spoken were now or never. "I do not know if I can ever truly forget what you did," he said, his voice thick with emotion and profound exhaustion. But maybe he amended, his voice softening. "I can find enough forgiveness within myself so that we can at least finish this together the way we should have from the very beginning." Anne nodded, her eyes overflowing with tears. For the first time in months, perhaps even years, she reached out to him. Andrew hesitated for a fraction of a second, still caught between the lingering pain and the nascent stirrings of forgiveness, but finally he yielded and accepted her touch. Anne's hand was surprisingly cold, yet strangely comforting. It was a touch that carried an echo of the distant past of the enduring love they had once so fiercely shared. That night, as darkness fully enveloped the house, Andrew knew with a quiet certainty that the end was near. But at least he would not have to face death alone. Andrew's death arrived on a night of profound stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath in peaceful anticipation. The air outside was cool and damp, the gentle breeze of late summer, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp soil and decaying leaves. Above, a vast expanse of ink-black sky stretched out, punctuated by a scattering of stars shining with a quiet, ethereal intensity, as if they were silent witnesses to this final earthly moment. Inside the house, a heavy silence reigned. It was not the hollow emptiness of solitude, but a silence pregnant with unspoken emotions, with lingering goodbyes, with unresolved feelings. The atmosphere felt almost oppressive, as if everyone within those walls was suspended in time, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. Anne and Sophie sat vigil by Andrew's bedside, each perched on a chair drawn close, one on each side, while Andrew, weakened beyond measure by the relentless disease, struggled to draw breath. His labored and irregular breathing, the only sound disrupting the heavy silence in the room, was a stark, brutal reminder of his fading vitality. The cancer had relentlessly drained his physical strength, but it had not extinguished his inner essence. In these final moments, Andrew remained recognizably the same man who, despite enduring immense adversity, had clung fiercely to his innate sense of dignity. The weeks leading up to this final night had been a complex tapestry woven with threads of excruciating pain and unexpected redemption for him and his fragmented family. Anne and Sophie, after remaining emotionally distant for so long, were now finally present, not merely in body, but in spirit, in a way Andrew had long feared he would never experience again. He knew with a deep, intuitive certainty that the end was near. He could feel it in every fiber of his failing body, in the increasingly faint rhythm of his heart, in the profound, soul-deep exhaustion that never truly lifted. But strangely, the raw, paralyzing fear that had haunted him in the initial months after his diagnosis had somehow receded, almost vanished. Now what he felt was not fear, but a quiet, almost welcoming sense of peace. He turned his weary gaze to Anne, noticing the deep lines of fatigue etched around her eyes, the subtle markings that time and shared suffering had carved into her face. For so long, he had harbored the bitter belief that her love was irrevocably lost, that he would die without ever reclaiming that vital connection. But here in the hushed stillness of the room, something undeniably different shone in her tear-filled eyes. A quiet, unwavering, genuine care, a depth of feeling he had long feared was gone forever. She was steadfastly by his side, just as she had promised, And in that simple act of presence, Andrew found a measure of solace that surpassed all expectations. Andrew then shifted his gaze to Sophie. The young woman sat silently beside her mother, her presence a quiet but powerful balm to his ravaged spirit. She who had distanced herself for so long, who had retreated into a world seemingly detached from his, was now here, a constant, almost unwavering source of quiet support. There was an unexpected strength in her quiet demeanor, a depth of resilience he could barely comprehend. It was as if with every passing minute she spent by his bedside, she was silently attempting to repair the gaping wounds left by years of emotional distance. The silence that stretched between them now was not oppressive or uncomfortable, but a shared understanding, a profound connection that transcended the need for spoken words. "Thank you," Andrew whispered, his voice barely audible, weak and trembling, almost a mere murmur that barely escaped his lips. The single word floated through the heavy air of the room as if absorbed by the oppressive atmosphere. It was the only expression of gratitude he could manage to offer for these precious final weeks in which they had somehow miraculously managed to reconnect, to rediscover a semblance of family. Anne leaned in closer, her hand tightening its grip on his cold and trembling fingers. She did not release his hand. It was as if that simple gesture was the anchor she so desperately needed, a desperate attempt to remain tethered to him for as long as she possibly could. Her eyes, brimming with unshed tears, reflected the soft glow of the bedside lamp in the corner of the room. Anne's gaze conveyed everything that words could not hope to express: the raw pain of regret, the crushing fear of impending loss, and above all else, the enduring love that, despite being suffocated for so many years, was still undeniably present. Sophie, sitting silently nearby, watched them both, her face etched with a quiet grief. She did not weep openly. Her presence was heavy with a deep, unspoken pain she did not seem to know how to articulate. Even without opening his eyes, Andrew could sense the quiet strength radiating from his daughter, a strength that emanated from her youth, her lingering guilt, and now from a profound desire to make amends. He felt it all wash over him in a wave of quiet understanding as his breaths became increasingly spaced out, shallower, longer, and he knew with unwavering certainty that the final moment was finally upon him, inevitable and inescapable. Andrew's last breath was soft and gentle, almost imperceptible, like a faint summer breeze that passes unnoticed. There was no dramatic flourish, no agonizing struggle, just a peaceful, quiet cessation. The silence that followed was overwhelming, more profound, more intense than anyone in the room could possibly bear. When Anne felt his hand loosen its grip in hers, she finally released a muffled sob, a raw, primal sound of grief, as if attempting to hold back the tidal wave of sorrow that was already threatening to consume her. Sophie almost instinctively leaned in closer, her arm encircling Andrew's still form, as if desperately hoping that somehow he was still present, that their final goodbye could be postponed for just one more precious moment. But Andrew was gone. The days immediately following the funeral were surreal and unsettling for both Anne and Sophie. Andrew's absence was not merely physical. It was as if the very heart of the house had been extinguished, its core purpose somehow lost. Every room felt strangely empty, devoid of the life and energy he had once embodied. And yet, paradoxically, something profound within them had irrevocably shifted. There was a new weight in their interactions, a shared, unspoken understanding that something fundamental had transformed them both. When the will was finally read, both Anne and Sophie were genuinely surprised by Andrew's final decisions. He had divided his substantial estate equally between them, without any trace of bitterness or resentment. But he had also thoughtfully left behind a personal letter with a deeply moving special request. In the letter, Andrew asked that a significant portion of his inheritance be specifically used to help other individuals and families facing the same devastating illness he had endured. A charitable foundation bearing his name would be established to provide crucial support, both financial and emotional, to families who, like him, felt utterly abandoned and isolated by their dire circumstances. It was a final act of profound generosity and selfless compassion that deeply resonated with both Anne and Sophie. Even in his final moments, Andrew's thoughts had extended beyond himself, focusing on how to transform his legacy into something truly meaningful, something that could make a tangible difference in the lives of others. As Anne read her husband's final words aloud, her composure finally crumbled and she wept openly. The raw regret she felt was so profound, so all-consuming, that it seemed to gnaw at her very soul. Why had she been so blind to Andrew's inherent kindness for so many years? Why had it taken her so long to truly see the exceptional man he truly was? She felt utterly diminished, almost insignificant in the face of his quiet, unwavering love and ultimate sacrifice. Sophie, on the other hand, viewed Andrew's final request as an unexpected opportunity for personal redemption. A chance to honor the enduring memory of the father who, despite everything, had maintained an unwavering belief in them both until his very last breath. Together, Anne and Sophie wholeheartedly fulfilled Andrew's final wish. The charitable foundation was meticulously established, and the considerable wealth that could have easily been squandered on material comforts instead brought tangible relief and immeasurable hope to countless others. Families grappling with the same devastating illness found vital support, both financial and emotional, ensuring that no one else would have to endure the crushing loneliness and soul-crushing despair that Andrew had so bravely faced in his final months. As they both reflected on the tumultuous events of the past months, Anne and Sophie finally understood that Andrew's true and enduring legacy was not rooted in material wealth or financial inheritance, but in the profound lessons of unconditional love, unwavering forgiveness, and selfless sacrifice he had so powerfully imparted. Andrew had shown them that even in the darkest, most despairing of circumstances, genuine redemption was always attainable, and in the end, he had subtly forced them to confront their own deepest flaws and devastating mistakes, ultimately revealing that true love is not about superficial perfection, but about unwavering presence, about steadfastly being there for each other in the most challenging moments when everything around you seems to be irrevocably falling apart. His death was not the definitive end, but on the contrary, it marked the unexpected beginning of something far greater. Andrew's enduring legacy lived on, not only in the countless lives he touched through his quiet generosity, but more importantly in the transformed hearts of his wife and daughter, who had finally found a new, more profound way to love and to move forward together.